Hi, this is Mrs. Bustamante. So when we left off, we were talking about some results that Mendel was seeing from his experiments. We were talking about how he had a P generation, and he would cross that and get his F1 generation, and then he would see traits like the short plant that had previously disappeared in his F1 generation reappear in his F2 generation. And he would see these same things happen over and over and over again in the same ratio with all the traits. So he starts to come up with some conclusions about his data. And he determines that traits are really determined by elements, which are genes, and there are various forms of this gene, and we call these various forms of the gene alleles. So you have two alleles for each type of gene. One comes from mom, one comes from dad. He also discovers his principle of dominance. So he says that a dominant allele will always be shown if it's present, and a recessive allele can be hidden by that dominant allele. Oftentimes we show dominant alleles with a capital letter, recessive alleles with a lowercase letter, just to show which one is dominant over the other. And Mendel got kind of lucky here. He happens to study all traits that show complete dominance. So this always held true when he was looking at traits. He also comes up with the principle of segregation. He says that each gamete, and remember you get one gamete from mom and one gamete from dad, had one allele for each gene, and they separated during meiosis. So if we go back to meiosis and we think about it, right, we know we have two chromosomes and we're going to separate them. So you're either going to get like this chromosome or this chromosome, and it's only going to have one allele of a specific gene on it. He also says that the principle of independent assortment. So that means that just because you get one gene doesn't mean you get another. They don't influence each other in terms of passing down from one generation to the next. They're not necessarily linked together. And again, he kind of gets lucky in this, but it's mostly true. That one, just because you say had purple flowers didn't necessarily mean you were short, right? You could be short and have white flowers as a plant, or vice versa. So what are the predictions of inheritance, and what are some terms we need to know when we start dealing with genetics problems, okay? Well, we need to know what a monohybrid cross is. So a monohybrid cross, mono means once, just means that we're showing allele pairing in an offspring for one trait at a time. We're going to talk about something called a genotype, and this is your allele combination. So we represent alleles in genetics with letters. It doesn't really matter what the letter is, it's just made up. But we use capital letters for dominant and lowercase letters for recessive typically. Sometimes we use a letter that represents the trait you're looking at, so maybe like tall. I would suggest, though, that you use letters that look different from each other in the capital and the lowercase. T is a good letter. R is a good letter. Some letters that tend to be hard are like S or O, because they look so similar when they're capital or lowercase, and be really careful in writing about them. So what's your genotype? Your genotype tells you, are you big T, or little t, or big T, little t? And we have two ways to describe that. If you're homozygous, we say you have two of the same alleles. And the way I like to think about this is if I run my pen across the top of my word, homo, all the letters are the same. So that means I have two of the same allele. If you're heterozygous, you can't run your pen across the top of it. You run into this T. So I like to make it very dramatic here. Heterozygous, you run into that T, means you have a different alleles. So you have a big T and a little t. They're just different. So that's your genotype that we show with your letters, your allele combination, and your phenotype is the physical characteristic displayed. What do you see? Is that plant tall or short? Does it have purple or white flowers? So here's what we know. Your genotype will code for your phenotype. Your genotype will code for your phenotype, meaning your genotype basically determines what phenotype you see, what physical characteristic you see.